this meeting will be recorded, and we will share this in a link with folks later so that you'll have access to it and can also share it. Just a quick note to my my co-hosts, Bill Christensen and Cynthia Brock, who are helping out today. If you need to get my attention, you may have to wave at me a little bit. I turned my sound down low right now because I realized I forgot to mute my chime alarm. So I didn't want that in the background for everybody to hear all of the folks coming in. So if you need my attention, at least initially you have to do that, and later on I'll turn that back on. So welcome to our 2021-2022 Positioning Theory Virtual Talk Series. And we will have a series of 4 talks across this academic year, fall and spring. And the next of those will be Thursday, November 18th. And that one will be at 10 a.m. These are talks that we're doing in live in Zoom. And one of the reasons for the time is we try to accommodate as many time zones as possible. Apologies to our folks on the Pacific Coast and elsewhere. I know this time doesn't work the best for you, but we do have a 10 a.m. start on that time. And so we look forward to having you all attend. You do need to register for each talk separately. So please keep that in mind. And we'll also put that information in the chat for you. Also, we're very excited about our 2022 Positioning Theory Research Conference. Some of you have been waiting years for this because of all of our delays that we've had, which were well beyond our control. We are very much hoping for an in-person conference in 2022 in the summer at the University of Buffalo. We're accepting proposals. They are due by December 10th. And there's a website where you can access the call for proposals. We also have a Word document to circulate. And again, we'll be putting some of that information in the chat for you. So without any further ado, I'll get started on the talk for today, Positioning Theory, Multimodality and Embodiment, Moving Beyond Speech to Speech and Other Acts. So first of all, what do we mean by positioning theory? I know a lot of you probably are familiar with positioning theory, and so I won't spend a lot of time going over this, but I thought for folks who might be newer, it would be helpful to have a little bit of background on where this particular use of positioning theory comes from, because there are different approaches to positioning and positioning theory. So some of you are familiar with this figure that I've developed with some collaborators for the positioning theory representation in this tree that indicates different places where the roots of positioning theory lie, in everything from feminist post-structuralism to philosophy, linguistics, speech act theory, and social psychology, and then some of the influences on this. There are also folks who write and are well known for their work in positioning. I'm going to really concentrate my work and frame it through the lens of the work developed by Rom Harré, Luk Van Langenhove, and Mogghaddam, and others who have taken up that work. This, I realize, is a very large and complicated table with a lot of prints on it, not the best for these types of presentations. So trust me, I'm not going to go through this whole thing square by square. But at the top of the screen, you'll see the reference for this. This was published recently in the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior, and a themed issue that Bo Christensen edited, revisiting Rom Harré's work. It's a terrific issue, so I highly recommend that. But you can find this particular table in that article. And so that's, if you want to see the whole thing and have some time to look at it in detail, you can study it. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things on here for you about what is positioning. So positioning is examining discursive acts and practices, studying speech acts and speech actions in conversational contexts, considering subject positions as pertaining to rights, duties, and particular discourse, understanding personhood and selfhood, considering metaphors and storyline present in one's own discourse and subject positions. And then, of course, in the initial piece by Davies and Harré, which was published in 1990, they identified self and other positioning, tacit and intentional positioning, and various other types of positioning. So that's one thing that folks have been working on, is identifying those various types of positions. In varieties of positioning, Van Langenhove and Harré also identified first and second order positioning, performative and accountive positioning, and moral and personal positioning. And again, people have built on, other scholars have taken these up and tried to interpret as they apply positioning theory to real world contexts, what does this mean? How can those be used? So there's much more than what I'm highlighting here. There has also been attention in positioning theory to consideration of consequence and agency rather than set roles. Subject positions allow for individuals to locate themselves within or even to resist narratives. And that's important. We're not limited just by we're not limited to the positions that we're forced to take up. We can also resist those positions. I also want to remind folks that that Harré and Mogghaddam emphasized in positioning in relation to performance style, the way people do things and the meanings ascribed to what they do in social situations, as alternative to reductionism and to what has often been stressed in psychology and certainly in educational settings, performance capacity, which is how well individuals do on specific tasks. So many of you will be familiar with the positioning triangle, and there are different versions of this, but basically this figure, which has speech and other acts, positions, and storylines on it. And a lot of the research that folks have done, both in applying positioning theory in naturalized, in real world context and natural settings, has focused on speech and conversation. A lot of the original examples that are in many of the theoretical papers have also focused on speech. Mogghaddam and Harré in 2010 wrote, "It is with words that we ascribe rights and claim them for ourselves and place duties on others." Speakers and hearers, as they engage in conversation, were part of what Davies and Harré were attending to in 1990. And they have some examples of that in their original work that they produced in 1990. There's also this reference in some of the positioning theory triangles and in the writings of Harré to speech and other acts. And I want to draw attention to the "and other acts" part of this today. So Mogghaddam and Harré write that positioning theory is about how people use words and discourse of all types to locate themselves and others. So what are these forms of communication beyond speech, those discourse of all types? Well, we know there's speech, there's talk, but also gestures, gaze, body position, images, and sounds. And what many scholars have, in the last 2 decades in particular, begun to refer to as multimodality, giving reference to the combination or multiple forms of modes that can be drawn upon to make meaning. So one of the things in terms of looking at the research study using positioning, if you look across the broad body of research, even across disciplines, one of the things that becomes apparent is that there's a lot of focus on talk and on speech. And that makes a lot of sense when you go back and look at where the roots of positioning theory lie in part. But there's less attention, although there is some mention in various writings, obviously, of things like gestures and gaze, the position of body, and so on. So there has been some work in this regard, and there are places where you can read a little bit about that in the piece that I mentioned that's in the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior. We do a very short review of some of the places where you can see some of that work. So there is some, but this is an area where folks who are interested in positioning theory, I think, can do a lot of work where we can push the field and the theory to explore in some different ways through the combination of these. So one of the things that I wanted to do as I started thinking about this was I asked the question, does Harré write about embodiment and positioning specifically, and trying to look for places where that work might occur. And I found a number of folks who are writing about Harré that helped me understand this. And then also looking back through, I found some places where Harré and others do write about or allude to different modalities of communication and also embodiment. I thought that the work of Farnell is particularly interesting in this regard. In her book, The Dynamic Embodiment for Social Literacy, sorry, I'm a literacy person. I have to make it all about literacy. The Dynamic Embodiment for Social Theory, I Move, Therefore I Am. Farnell writes, Harré's theory of conversational or discursive realism must be enriched to include not only speech exchanges, but gestures, other body movements, and indeed any semiotic meaning-making practices as alternative forms of discourse, so that we can assert such practices create a social world just as physical causality generates a physical one. And it might sound here like she's disagreeing with Harré, or at least saying, well, we need to extend this theory over, but she actually goes through in some of her work and points to places where Harré and others have actually begun this work, and she explores that, which is an interesting exercise in itself. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to also is that Harré alluded to in both physical being and social being, and I'm quite sure in other places as well, that the consideration of embodiment and positions also requires alternative research methods. So thinking about position and thinking about embodiment, different modes of meaning making, one of the things that has always been interesting to me is this notion that position itself is both a metaphor, but a physical manifestation. So Harré wrote in Social Being, the self is a location. The sense of self is the sense of being located at a point in space, of having perspective in time, and of having a variety of positions in local moral orders. So here, the self is located within these local moral orders. But I think one of the reasons why positioning is when a lot of folks encounter positioning theory, people are very drawn to it. I think in part because we recognize the idea of position in our very embodied being, in our sense of self, not just through language, but because we are physical beings and our interactions with the world and with others are what create this meaning for us. So I went back, and one of the things I did was I looked at I looked at physical being, went back and revisited that that text and looked through it for various places where Rom talks about this connection between making meaning and the physical. And one of the things that that I was interested in trying to trace was how he writes about this. I was hoping actually that this revisiting and looking at this would really put everything in place, make all those connections between positioning theory and the physicality and embodiment very clear to me, but it didn't exactly. And knowing Rom and his work, I should have probably not been surprised by that. But he writes that people are active beings making use of all sorts of material to try to create orderly lives, or at worst, the appearance of orderliness. He says, we use our bodies for grounding personal identity in ourselves and recognizing it in others. We use our bodies as points of reference in relation to other material things. We use our bodies for the assignment of all sorts of roles, tasks, duties, and statuses. And so there you see a very direct overlap with some of the language that's used in the positioning theory work. We use our bodies for the expression of moral judgments. So there's a chapter, and this was the chapter in particular that I was hoping would make everything fall into place. It's highly theoretical with some illustrations. If you're new to positioning theory or new to thinking about embodiment and multimodality, I would not start here, okay? But it is interesting. And it was also interesting to me that Rom connected this to semiotics and also to Peirce, Barthes, Saussure a little bit, and wrote things in that chapter such as the human body is such that it states, conditions, parts, and postures serve as signs. It is both a semantic system in itself and made meaningful by a semiotic system. So if we think about this, meaning is not just in the head or in the body, but in the world. That is, meaning does not reside in the form of words or even images, but within our relationships among and across experiences, actions, talk, people, and all sorts of culturally situated knowledge. And this is very much what positioning is about in these connected and discursive relationships with other people, but also with the world. And that's something that positioning theory and Rom's writing draws our attention to. So positions are grounded in our lived temporal experiences. They are related to in the world perceptual and embodied responses. And that is something I think that for folks who are working with positioning theory is something that we can try to both theorize some of those connections a little more explicitly. Remember, when Rom was doing some of this writing, the publication dates, for example, 91, 93. So he's writing this work in the 80s and 90s. He's working on it. And there's a lot that's been done since. And I think there are some places where we can make connections going forward. Some of you maybe have already If you're familiar with social semiotics, thought about recent work in multimodality and also the work of folks like Gunther Kress. Kress writes, in the reception of a sign, the materiality of modes interacts with the physiology of bodies. When I see a gesture, I come to understand its meaning, say the extent of the sweep of a hand movement or its pace. Mimetically, both by an inner invisible parallel performance for myself or through an outer visible performance in which I experience in my body what the meaning of that gesture might be. I have caught myself attempting to imitate gestures which I had noticed in order to feel their meaning, which is kind of like James when he says, we feel our meaning in the seat of ourselves. There are as well the meanings suggested by signs in the accompanying environment. Signs made in gesture are culturally shaped, as are all the signs in any mode. And I think there are connections here that we can draw on in positioning theory and also in thinking about these other modalities. So I've talked some about Rom Harré's work and some of the connections there. And I also went back to the original piece from 1990 that was published in the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior, the Davies and Harré piece. And I started thinking about, particularly as I reread that piece, it has the conversational examples that are there, but I was struck by also what is the contribution, I'm sure, of Bronwyn Davies at the end, where there's the discussion of the children's story, the paper bag princess. And in the paper bag princess, the two characters, Elizabeth and Ronald, are children in this story who are supposed to be, Elizabeth is a princess, Ronald is a prince, they're supposed to be getting married. There's that whole narrative that runs undergirds this piece, but Ronald gets carried off by a dragon and Elizabeth has to go and save him. And in so doing, she, as you might imagine, when fighting a dragon, gets a little dirty and messed up. And Ronald says, he's not so sure she's really a good enough princess for him because she doesn't look like a princess. And she says, enough of this, a parting of the ways. And so they do not get married and live happily ever after. Elizabeth goes off to do her own thing. So in the example around this, there's a discussion of storylines and how positions can be disrupted. And if you're familiar with Bronwyn Davies' work around children's narratives and stories and gender, she writes about this in other places as well. It exemplified children's gender positions and also the disruptions of those positions. It highlighted the lived narratives and how those are embodied in the narratives of the children in the story. And she writes later, these are the body landscape relations, right, that she writes of, wherein positions, rights, and duties, more orders, are created not only through conversations, through speakers and hearers, but through all embodied modalities. So we can actually think about both the children's story and the representation of that narrative, but also as a book, it has other images. It has lots of potentials there for ways that positions get constructed in that. And she writes about some of this a little bit more explicitly in the piece that I referenced there, the 2003 piece. So this is from Bronwyn Davies, Positioning the Subject in Body Landscape Relations. She writes, discourse and other patterns of communication provide the basis for knowing how to read landscape and for knowing how to manage embodied existence within it. So there's that connection again to this notion of embodiment. And quoting Butler, Davis continued, discourse is not merely spoken words, but a notion of signification which concerns not merely how it is that certain signifiers come to mean what they mean, but how certain discursive forms articulate objects and subjects in their intelligibility. And so part of what Davies explores in this chapter, which is in the Self and Others, which was published in 2003, is this notion of how people are embodied within particular landscapes. So in tracing these pieces back, I didn't find that one passage or that one chapter or something that like made all of the connections that I wanted to have in front of me related to embodiment and positioning theory. But I think if we look across the writings of Rom Harré, Bronwyn Davies and other folks, you start to see some of these places where this can readily be connected, and it is part of it. In a single passage from the 1990 piece, Davies and Harré wrote, "We take on the discursive practices and storylines as if they are our own and make sense of them in terms of our particular experiences. The sense of continuity that we have in relation to being a particular person is compounded out of continued embodiment and also spatio-temporal continuity and shared interpretations of the subject positions and storylines available within them. How to do being a non-contradictory person within a consistent storyline is learned both through textual and lived narratives." And they also talk at this point about how you can resist some of those narratives. So positioning theory, as I've said, is about words, but also discourse of all types. And so I want to end by highlighting some of those other discourses of all types. You see in this image, the boxes that are drawn around, drawing attention to all of the different modalities of facial expression, gaze, speech, body orientation, and so on. But I also want to draw attention to the notion of artifacts and the role that those play in positioning, because we tend to think about what humans themselves are producing in speech or maybe making a gesture, those types of things, but thinking about artifacts and also methods and how we can use some new methods and what do we mean by new. So as just a reminder, Harré had made this comment at a few points, and we've also talked about this, a number of us at different the positioning theory conferences and some of these prior talks where there is a need here for this. But what does new mean, right? So it's interesting when you go back to physical being, right? Rom mentioned Saussure, Peirce, Barthes, and there's also a number of other folks on this list historically with work on semiotics or social semiotics, and more recent works such as the Routledge Handbook of Multimodality and things of that nature. So what does new mean? Well, as many people point out, there are no new ideas. They've all been around in some form before. But what has happened, I think, in the last 20 years in particular, is that people have started to really dig in and look at how do we make meaning, particularly, I think, given the changing technologies that are now part of our world. So when, remember back when some of the first positioning theory work was coming out, the internet, for example, was in its infancy. There was no YouTube. There were no cell phones that played videos for us. And there's a lot that has changed, both in the ways we can conduct research, but also in the ways that we communicate through image in particular, because it's become so much part of how we can communicate in our daily lives. So I wanted to mention some various approaches to multimodality. It's a whole different talk to talk through, what is multimodality, some of the nuances and some of the different approaches to analysis. But I did want to just give a nod to this, that there are different approaches. And if you're interested in those, Carrie Jewett lays out several different approaches in the Routledge Handbook of Multimodal Analysis. There are obviously other ways to think about these in the various domains, but that's a useful place to start if you're not familiar with this. So I want to give you to close two examples of foregrounding artifacts in storylines, in positioning, in moral orders, and rights and duties. And Jaspal, Carrière, and Mogghaddam actually have a couple of interesting artifacts that got me thinking about some of this work in their piece, where they give examples from the Iranian Revolution and women wearing the hijab, and how as an artifact, the hijab was used to position particularly women, but others as well in society through storylines, positioning moral orders and rights and duties. And they also have a brief discussion of the US Confederate flag in a similar capacity. So as I started thinking about this, one of the things that I attended to was the recent events in artifacts surrounding the global COVID-19 pandemic. And these provide a useful illustration of the role that artifacts play. So when we think about things like face masks, these in the US were traditionally considered the domain of healthcare workers. If you're in a hospital, right, a dentist's office, or certain people who work in trades where they might need to keep dust out. In some countries, for example, where my husband's family resides in China, it's very routine to wear masks to keep out pollution. Also, if you think you have a cold, that's been a commonplace practice there for quite some time. But in the US, this was not part of the practice. And in this particular example, if we think about it, there were storylines that unfolded around masks, wherein wearing face masks became a physical, a social representation, a signifier in a storyline. And masks in that way are in a way of inscribing meaning upon the body. And refusing to wear a mask became affiliated, and is still affiliated, with particularly ideologies downplaying the serious infective capabilities of the virus. And in this instance of the masks and the different pandemic, there are these different storylines that unfolded in relation to institutional, cultural, personal, legal, and conversational moral orders. And following the lead of former President Trump, many Americans argued that it was their personal and legal right to forego mask wearing. And what's interesting in this storyline is that in cases where health officials mandated masks, and in where this is still happening in the US, what the issue of personal right, individual right, is placed well ahead of any duties. And so we have a case where the positions and the unfolding storylines around this artifact, the rights of one person, it could be a president, it could be one person on an airplane, are held above the duties to others. And the analysis of positions in moral orders with the mask as artifact demonstrate a crucial role in the cultural, legal, institutional, conversational, and personal moral orders. So this example also, I think, demonstrates the power of an artifact surrounded by all of those other conversations and other ways of making meaning, right? Sharing things through media as well. And the social forces of utterances and objects have real world consequences. So at the time we were writing the piece that I've referenced earlier for the Journal of Theory of Social Behavior last year, at that time, over 470,000 people in the US had died. And estimates were that at that time, 100,000 lives could have been saved if people had worn masks. Now, since many other folks have unfortunately passed away, those numbers, both for the loss of people's lives, but also people who could potentially be saved through wearing masks is even higher now. And so the example that I'm trying to make here is, I want to be clear that this is not I'm not using this example to make some sort of political statement, but rather that this is a real world consequence where if we attend to only the speech act, but don't look at the artifact and how it is interfacing with that, we miss a lot of what is going on. I would argue that the object, the artifact, the mask is a nexus across what Luk Van Langenhove has referred to as a field of moral orders. And so understanding how this has unfolded may actually also help us to figure out how to interrupt or how to change the positions of people in ways that really do have a real world consequence for folks. I want to give another example, and this example comes from work that we've done with children in engineering literacies clubs. And so this takes place in an after-school setting where we wanted to look at all of these different modalities of communication and how the children were engaging. So these are children who are ages roughly 8 to 11, somewhere in that range. And many of the children that we worked with in this context were learning English as an additional language or as a second language. Some of them had been in the US for several years and some for only a few months. The way that we looked at this, just to back up for a second, we took various forms of self-other positioning, which had been identified in prior work that I had done with teachers and teachers' discussions, particularly of race, language, literacy, and culture. And I credit my graduate research assistants for this idea where they said, hey, let's take these and see what happens in engineering club. And at first I was like, not so sure about that. But I think what happened in the end was really interesting, so that we started to look at this around the artifacts in particular. And the self aligned with artifact and oppositional positioning is something that we saw in particular with a few students. And Sabira was one of those students. And she, in this photo, Sabira is sitting with her back to us. You can see the back of her braid. And Fatima is looking on in the pink shirt, and Emma is looking away. And what's important here is that in front of Sabira, what you have are both materials and an artifact that's emerging. So the paper on the table that she's pointing to with her right hand is actually the beginning of the children were asked to build a pedestal to support a stuffed animal, and they're using index cards and masking tape to build this structure. And so with one hand, Sabira is pointing to the emerging artifact, and notice that she has her other hand firmly on the tape. This is a position of power in the group. This was a role that we started referring to, or a position we referred to as the keeper of the tape, because it gave anyone who was the keeper of the tape a great deal of power in the group. But what Sabira did routinely throughout this process of, and not just in this moment, but across the days of working on the project, was she would align herself with the artifact, and really as opposition to her group mates oftentimes in a power, in a way to control the structure that was emerging. We also saw other instances where there was communication and collaboration. So you can see these red circles on the screen, and it's not so important that you see exactly what Ben is doing with his hands, but but what he is doing is he's bringing his hands together, he's moving them apart, and he's using his hands to communicate an idea to the rest of the children in the group. If you notice this group, they're looking on, they're leaning in, they're paying attention to what Ben is trying to tell them. Ben had been in the United States for about 6 months when this occurred. He's originally a Chinese speaker and he had come from China. So he still was in the process of becoming an emerging bilingual. He oftentimes didn't have the words that he needed to express himself, but he would rely a great deal on gesture and other types of modes for communication. If you look at the verbal transcripts of this, where he aligns himself with the artifact, but it's also collaborative, right? He's working with others around this. Ben says, "Yay, I got it." Fatima, "Yeah, Ben, do you create on the box?" Ben says, "Not a box, 2 cards, 1 card, 2 cards, 1 card, 2 cards, 1 card, 2 cards, 1 card." And he holds, that's where he's doing those hand motions, right? Right here, 2 cards, 1 card. Fatima says, "Oh yeah." And Jacob says, "Oh, so you stack the cards." And then, "Yes," says Ben and Jacob, "and you make like a thing that you can sit on." And Ben says, "Yes," and laughs. And Jacob, "Put a card under," and Ben says, "Yeah, like a chair." So if you look at just this transcript alone, it doesn't really tell you very much, right? It's hard to tell. What does this mean? 1 card, 2 cards, right? But when you look at what's happening through all of the different modalities, you can start to see how Ben is able to, in this case, using gesture and reference to the specific cards and artifact, communicate his idea, and the other children pick up on it and help revoice what some of that is going to be. We also found instances of this where Dimitri and Ben worked together. And there was a time where they were working on another project. This one happened to be building a rubber band car. And on this day in particular, the boys were at the table around the artifact. They were on the floor. At one point, Ben used the sound of a car engine that he recreated to try to communicate to Dimitri about what they were trying to do, and it worked, and they were able to move ahead on their project. So they used a lot of different modalities in working on this project, and they also said things to one another in their conversation that were really important. And one of those is this quote from Dimitri, who starts off, he says, it's hard, Ben, very hard. And Ben says, "But if we two work together," and Dimitri says, "It's not going to be too hard because we two have great ideas." And I did not make this up. They really, they really said this. And it was kind of classic Ben and Dimitri working together to solve their problems collaboratively, but aligning themselves around the artifact and the materials to do so. The conversational utterances themselves are not enough to communicate that full meeting. So we saw again and again through Engineering Club instances of children gathered around artifacts and materials, and how important those were also in positioning one another, but also in communication. And just a quick comment to close. Emma was another student who we looked at. She spoke very little, and over coming to work with her over 3 years, we realized that she is just a quiet kid. But again and again, we saw her positioning herself through action and communicating ideas through the use of materials and artifacts and these various embodied processes. So just to close, to leave you with a couple of thoughts and challenges. Positioning theory, right, Harré and Mogghaddam, like all good theories, positioning theory is a very practical tool and can help us navigate the real world. I love theory. I'm very interested in theory, but I also am interested in how do we work with teachers or children or folks in the world to make the world a better place to work for through transformative processes. And I think one of the ways that we can continue to do this is by looking at, again, if we're talking about positioning theory, focusing also on discourse of all types and taking up the challenge to look at that more closely and figuring out how do we use various methods, some of which are already existing and people are using, and combine those, but also push things ahead. And also, I think we need to think about future forming practice. Gergen has been critical of writing theory and just producing things for academic purposes and talking to other theorists. And he says that future forming practice is a practice in which social change is indeed the primary goal. And I think that's one of the things that we can use positioning theory for across a variety of disciplines and fields to ultimately think about how do we study things and look at them and then think about future forming practice in ways that we can bring about social change for a more equitable world, more transformative processes in our society. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions at this point. And I will also stop the screen sharing. If you have a question, you can put your question in the chat. We do, because we're on a Zoom call, if you'd prefer to unmute yourself and ask your question, you can do that. You can also raise a hand, and I think Bo and Cindy are going to help monitor to see if there are questions. So any of those ways, put things in the chat, raise a hand, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you prefer.
Mary, thank you for that wonderful talk. One of the questions in the chat, so maybe we should all give Mary a warm round of applause for that incredible talk. One of the questions in the chat is from Jillian is, will the slides be shared with the participants?
So I think we can share the slides with participant, and the talk will be recorded too. So I can send those out.
Another question, Mary, is Martha wants to know if the work with the engineering club is published, and if so, where?
Yeah, there is. We have a variety of pieces on engineering club that have been published. If you go to our the Center for Literacy and Reading Instruction and look under research, there's a listing of some of the articles there. So we've published them, and there's a piece in there's a themed issue in Theory into Practice where we have some of this work. The piece that I mentioned from the Journal of Theory of Social Behavior, at the end of our theoretical discussion, the examples from Engineering Club that I talked about today, we talk about in more detail there as well. And so there are a number of places to find those. I think they're probably also listed on my Google Scholar page, but if you want specific ones, I can also share some of those if you contact me.
And then Mary, there's another question. Johannes actually mentioned that they have done some work on this topic, and this person put a link in the chat. But the question that Johanna asks is, you have spoken about materiality and embodiment as a type of discourse. Relating back to the positioning theory triangle, would you say that we can also analyze material embodied storylines, rights, duties, and moral orders?
That's a good question. I think if I'm understanding it correctly, I mean, the short answer is yes, you can. And I think that part of it is, and this is where all of those things that happen, the ways that we engage in positioning are, we're always part of the world, right? We're always part of this embodied process. I don't think that there, as I said, there are some places where people have looked at that beyond speech, but not a lot. And people have looked at other things too. Maybe I should say beyond words, because there are folks who've looked at printed documents, and those types of things, but it's very verbocentric in what has been done to date. But I think if we're talking about the other ways that meaning can be inscribed, then we should be looking at how bodies play a part in that. And actually in physical being, Rom uses the example at one point of, I think it's tattoos he's looking at, it actually meaning literally inscribed on the body. And so if you think about the ways that artifacts or meanings get communicated, then I would argue we should also be looking at those from an embodied standpoint in terms of making meaning.
Thanks, Mary. Beatrice asks, thank you. Well, she mentions, thank you for sharing your work. I'm wondering if you have shared this work with teachers. If so, can you share more about this experience?
The positioning theory work in general, I have, and one of the things I found in sharing that work and talking about positioning, particularly with teachers and the context of working with predominantly white teachers in the US, who are white women, in talking with them about positioning and positioning theory, one of the things that some of them started to do in the teacher ed classes, when I introduced this, I had people who actually took this up and started looking at their own narratives, rather accident. I'd like to say that I intentionally arranged all of that, but actually I had a student who came back to me and was like, I went back and looked at my narrative. Here's all the things I found, right? And one of the things she realized was that she was positioning herself as the teacher and referring to students as they and them. And these are students where she's a white teacher, these are Black students. And she realized this is really important for me to recognize. It's not just a pronoun, right? And Rom has written about this is as well, that how we index ourselves and others is a reflection of position. So as teachers introduced me to the idea of having them use positioning theory to analyze their own stories, we worked with that more in class, more strategically to think, let's think about positions, right? And so I've learned a lot from teachers in that regard. We haven't shared a lot of the positioning theory work and interpretations around engineering directly with teachers yet. We are actually hoping to start a project soon where we're going to try to use positioning as a means of helping teachers think about their multilingual learners and repositioning students as well.
Thank you, Mary. Krishna asks, have you done any work on application of positioning theory to online remote teaching during COVID lockdown?
I have not done any work on that, and I haven't seen any on the COVID related lockdown. There is work that has been done in distance ed or online environments. So that's one of the places that when we look across different disciplines, there are a number of folks who have started looking at online environments and distance learning are using positioning theory, but I don't know of anything specifically related to COVID.
Another person asks, can you explain how the concept of identity is used in positioning theory?
Okay, so that's an interesting question because there's a lot to that, I think. So thinking about identity and positioning theory, I guess I think there are narrower and broader perspectives that we can take here. So, I think about like Rom's writing, not necessarily just about positioning theory related to personhood and self and those types of constructs. I think that that's helpful to read about and understand. Speaking more in relation to methods and applying this in my case, using this in educational contexts, I think looking at types of positioning is one of the ways that we can think about identity, because we construct ourselves both in in interaction with others, but sometimes also in oppositions or resistance to others or to other storylines, right? Our identities are constantly in flux as we encounter these different narratives or storylines, some of which may want to position us in ways that we don't want to be positioned. So one of the questions I think that again, speaking from a position where we're looking at applying these in educational contexts, if we're thinking about identity, how do we look at identity, and how do we try to examine that with the work that I've done with using self-other positioning and various types of that, it arose in part from that question of identity, which was how are white teachers who are predominantly monolingual women positioning themselves in relation to their identity and reading about various populations of students who have diverse linguistic, racial, ethnic backgrounds who may be unlike themselves. And one of the ways that we were able to trace identity, I think, was by looking at those different types of self and other positioning. Because when we started coding at the level of a sort of practical application, we went, wait a minute, everything is self-other positioning, because every time you position yourself, even if there's no one present, right, there, you're positioning others as well. So we had to figure out how to apply that.
So just a quick comment, there are lots of thanks in the chat and some references, like Harré, who's going to be doing one of the later talks in this series, mentions a dissertation by Dr. Angel Stedman at University of Arizona, who did an analysis using positioning theory of an online MA program. And then Mary, there's another question. Thanks for sharing this interesting work. I wish to know how we can interpret moral orders when we consider body as part of embodiment and positioning theory.
So I think this is a challenging question when we start looking at moral orders and in the body, because it is important to remember that thinking about even an example like the artifact, like the face mask, part of how the meaning of that gets created is through the speech acts that occur around it, right? So we want to be aware of that. It's never just like an action alone or an artifact alone. So I think that one of the things is trying to think about the context, and then what are the research questions you're trying to look at. And this is a pretty broad questions. How do we interpret moral orders when we consider the body and embodiment? So it depends a lot on your context and what you're trying to do. I think that we can also think about these as moral fields, and I like the piece that Luk Van Langenhove has in I think it's Frontiers in Sociology, Psychology. I always mix the journal up, but it's from 2017, where he writes about moral fields and this idea that if we think about moral fields, within those, there's a past, a present, a future that can be part of any action or any speech event, right? And that's where this connection to moral orders and the body or embodied processes it is important, because it's not just what we say, it's what we do. And it's also what are the other material artifacts or objects that we're using in that process as well. I don't think if you're looking for very specific examples of how to interpret this from this point of view, there's not a lot of work yet on that. I might, unless there's something out there that I don't know about where someone's fully articulated this. And if they have, I would love to know about it. But I think this is still emerging. I think, Sukhinder, I think that's a great question. I think this is work we can do. Bo?
Yeah, I was just thinking about whether we should distinguish between normative orders and moral orders. because the question could be about whether morality has a certain kind of embodiment and whether normativity has a certain kind of embodiment as well. So, I mean, I was just thinking about whether we should distinguish between those two so we can have a discussion of whether there's a particular discourse, a moral discourse, which are tied to embodiment. And then there's kind of like a normative dimension to all kinds of embodiments as well.
That's a really great point. And I think that I would love to see you write that up, and so that we could have further work to build on, because I think that that's part of what I feel like there are a lot of areas where we can explore this further and try to articulate in ways that help one another in our scholarly work or in our research work, that we're applying particular things maybe to real world settings, and to try to figure out how do we talk about this in ways that are more specific in some ways and more helpful, and that also give us directions to build on the work. I see a lot of pieces in positioning theory when I'm reviewing or reading, where people are doing work, but they're not talking to each other. And I think that we're not moving things maybe forward. There are a lot of the same foundational pieces cited, for example. So I think what you're pointing to is ways that we can expand that conversation and move the ideas around positioning theory ahead too a little bit, and that are helpful to others. Thank you for that comment.
Do we have time for one last question? I think Louisa has one. She says, is it always the case that when positioning changes, the storyline also changes? On doing analysis of political discourses, we often find it difficult to see that this happens.
I think when the positioning, when positionings change, the storylines I think might change, but I don't think that they necessarily change, right? And political discourses, in fact, may be one of those types of discourses where, I don't know, I haven't looked at this in this way, but just thinking about the example of masks, that certain positions can change, but the storyline that's being constructed at one level doesn't necessarily change. I think we see in the US right now where certain positions have changed pretty specifically at institutional levels, for example, but that in certain storylines, that those positions haven't shifted the storyline, right? The storyline is still pretty similar to what it would be if we were to conduct analysis. And I'm trying to remember, I think we submitted the first discussion of the mask example about a year ago. So we were writing that and assuming that things would look quite different. But I think what I would say is that some of those storylines that I had expected would be shifted and positions would be changed have in fact not. So my hunch is that no, you wouldn't necessarily see that shift.
That's a very useful answer. Thank you very much, Mary.
So I think, oh, go ahead, Luk. Or go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about whether there was any other questions. I have one. Concerning the embodiment, I was just thinking about whether you think there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, in cognitive science of actually trying to move meaning out of the head, as Hilary Putnam says, and a lot of that stuff is actually concerning embodiment as well. I mean, the 4E cognition, enactive cognition, embodiment cognition as well. Have you touched upon that in some of your work?
There's a piece that we did that is a review, started off as a review of schema theory, and it's called Schema Theory Revisited, and published in the Review of Educational Research. And in that piece, we actually started looking at schema theory, which is comes out of that information processing, or generally is held to be coming out of that information processing, first generation cognitive science approach. And part of what we started doing was thinking about how schema and schemata are socially constructed, thinking about Vygotsky's work, thinking about influences of embodiment, Varela, Thompson, and Roche, and other folks like that. And then going back even further to Bartlett's work, who folks generally credit with some of the first work on schema, and realizing that if you go back and look at that early writing, that even there you see this attention to embodied processes and not just things going on in the head, even in terms of reading, right? And so that's one of the places where we've written about that. It's something I think that, again, there could be more work done, and I think it's worth trying to write about even more explicitly, to think about what do those perspectives, like in the 4E work, what do those perspectives have to bring to positioning theory and positioning studies? And then also, what does positioning theory bring into those perspectives? So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
I
Bill.
agree.
Yeah. I think that we're just about out of time. I do want to, I don't know if there are any other, Cindy, if you had anything else to add to this session. I want to just remind folks about the conference that's upcoming, and then also for the virtual talk series. And just remember, you have to sign up for all of those individually. And the next talk will start at 10 a.m. Eastern time instead of at 9. Cindy, did you have anything else?
Just one final thanks if the group could give you one final thanks for doing such a wonderful job here, Mary. We really appreciate your talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.